Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you and welcome to LeadAfrik.com. Today, we will be discussing the economic legacy of the economist who became president of the Republic of Kenya, Emilio Stanley Mwai Kibaki. Like every person, Mwai Kibaki had a story. Before he became president, he was something else. And I'll start by diving into who this gentleman was. But many of you who were born at that time remember December 30th, 2002, as the day when President Daniel Torotich Arap Moi, 2 decades and 4 years in power, was brought to an end. It was at Uhuru Park. There was a man in a wheelchair with a plaster on his leg, and he had faced a near-fatal car accident, just a few weeks earlier. There were hundreds of thousands at Uhuru Park in the scorching sun of late December. Those of you who are in Kenya understand this period very well, in the lead up to January, when it gets quite hot. That moment felt huge. It was enormous. It was a new Independence Day of sorts. People felt that there was a new awakening, and the tight grip of President Moi on power had finally come to an end. The name of this gentleman was Emilio Mwai Stanley Kibaki, who had the following to say: that government will no longer be run on the whims of individual. It was a tone of change that in many ways observers could say he truly lived up to. So we will spend an hour today having this conversation. We will go deep, we will be honest, and we will look at the numbers because, as they say, numbers don't lie. That said, we must always err on the side of caution because anyone can use numbers to justify anything. We'll start with the man before the president. Let us understand who Kibaki was before he took power. What were his credentials and why do they matter? This gentleman was born many years ago. 5 years from now, he will be turning 100 while he alive. He was born on November 15th, 1931 in Gatuyaini village, Nyeri district. He was a son of Kikuyu peasant farmers. He was baptized Emilio Stanley, and for most of his public life, he was known as Mwai Kibaki, which is interesting. And you can say that, Emilio Stanley, but for most of his life, he is regarded as Mwai Kibaki. He went to Mangu High School, which is a prestigious high school in Kenya. Many of you will be familiar with it as one of the national schools in our country. And he was brilliant right from the very start, got top grades while at Mangu. He then proceeded to study at Makerere University in Uganda. Many important figures attended Makerere University. For those of you who have studied history, understand that this is an institution that trained a lot of early leaders of Africa post-independence. He got first-class honors in economics, so did exceptionally well, then proceeded to the London School of Economics, where he did a Bachelor's of Science in Public Finance and also under distinction. He was there on a scholarship from Commonwealth. After studying in London School of Economics, he went back to Makerere, this time not as a student, but as an assistant lecturer in economics. So you can get to appreciate that Kibaki is not a man who learned economics in politics. He learned it in the classroom and learned it well because he essentially had 2 degrees. One of them strictly economics and the other one economics adjacent, because Bachelor of Science in Public Finance. Before president, he had an economic track record. Remember, he joined politics in 1960. He was born in 1931. For those of you who are doing the math, he was only 29 years old. And he was requested by Tom Mboya, who was also a very young man at the time. He was then elected to parliament in 1963. So you realize a pattern that back in the day, not so many people were educated. And so the few who had education had it a little easier in the way of finding opportunities than you will today. If you have a degree today, you still need a little more to distinguish yourself. Back in the day, you could count the number of Africans who had had some level of education, and even having a high school certificate meant a lot more than it does today. He served as a minister of finance. So this is a person who really understood how Kenya's finance worked. And he served between 1963 and 1973. And at that time, the GDP of Kenya grew quite rapidly at 6.6% annually from 1963 to 1973. And then it expanded even further to 7.2% annually in the 1970s. Just to clarify, Kibaki was a Minister of Finance and Economic Planning between 1969 and 1982. For those of you who are quick at math, that should be about 13 years, so well over a decade. In 1978, he was approached for an offer by the World Bank to serve as the Vice President for Africa. He rejected that offer because he wanted to continue serving Kenya in the capacity that he did as a Minister of Finance and Economic Planning. Another key lesson that we learned from him, you need to have a clear vision. There are many opportunities that will come along the way, but if you train your eyes on something that you genuinely and deeply care about, like Kibaki did, then that could amount to something, and it did in his case. He is widely regarded as one of Kenya's most effective ministers of finance or finance ministers. Today, we don't call them ministers, we call them cabinet secretaries, but to this day, he remains one of the most effective. But that did not end there. He also served as a vice president between 1978 and 1988. Many of you will know that this was under the presidency of Daniel Toroitich arap Moi. For 10 years, he was vice president before he became an opposition member of parliament between 1992 and 2002. In this period, he ran for president twice and lost twice. In other words, he unsuccessfully ran for president twice before he got it at the third run in December 2002, and he won with 62% of the vote. We could say that was a landslide, especially given how much grip Moi had had on power. It was a significant performance. It's also important to note that Moi did not run in 2002. Instead, he picked Uhuru Kenyatta to lead KANU's side, and Uhuru Kenyatta lost to Kibaki. So before we go further, it's important to understand the context within which this economist is rising to presidency. The GDP growth rate in Kenya 2002 was between 0.4% to 0.5%. It's very close to zero. In other words, our economy was growing almost at a flat level. In real terms, Kenya was technically in a recession because our GDP contracted in 2 consecutive quarters of 2002. For those of you who know the textbook definition of a recession is any economic contraction for any 2 given consecutive quarters, and that's what happens in Kenya. And the GDP had fallen quite significantly from 4.5% in 2001 to near zero. So this looks like a cliff edge. The GDP just fell quite significantly. So it was not essentially a plateau. It was a sharp drop. Okay, you could talk about it as a cliff edge. But Kenya was also in a significant debt crisis. And around this time, the debt to GDP had peaked to about 78% of GDP around 2000 and remained high when Kibaki inherited power. Debt had averaged between 53 and 63% of GDP through the final years of Moi in power between 1999 to 2002. The overwhelming majority of the government revenue was going to recurrent expenditures. And recurrent expenditures are expenditures that the government incurs just to keep running, to keep the lights up, to keep the taps running. So there was very little money that was being allocated towards development. There was very little that was being set aside for new projects that will help Kenya revive its growth. So Kenya was essentially stagnating at the time when Kibaki is coming in. And so the overwhelming majority of the revenue at the time was being used to pay salaries and to pay debt. And so Kenya's relationship with international financial institutions was strained as a result. So maybe many Western donors pulled back, and Kenya's relationship with the International Monetary Fund, popularly known as IMF, or commonly referred to as IMF, had a fractured relationship with Kenya at the time. At this time, Kibaki is inheriting a system where corruption is the order of the day. There was institutional rot. Corruption was rampant. It was everywhere. It was systemic. It was normalized. We all knew it. It happened. That is a way of things. That is Kenya. Be it as it may, do with it as you may. That is what Kibaki is inheriting. He is inheriting state corporations that had collapsed and were bleeding money. The roads were broken. The hospitals were under-equipped. Schools were in a state of disrepair. Foreign investments had dried up. So Kibaki is really inheriting a country that is, in many ways, very troubled. Moi had done very little to fight corruption. If anything, his government really enabled the entrenchment of corruption in Kenyan politics, so much so that it has become extremely difficult to root out that corruption. And you will see that this is one of the accusations that Kibaki faced, that he was unable to deal with corruption. But also, it's important to recognize that you are coming in a system that by its design and nature is extremely corrupt, a challenge that Kenyans continue to struggle with to this day. So the political mood at the time, it's not hard to understand why people felt jubilant, because if nothing is working, any change is seen as important, as revolutionary, as great, as welcome change. And so Moi had been in office for 24 years. For many people who are probably watching this, for the amount of life you've been on this planet, if you are under 24, all that time, one president was in power, and that was Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi. Kenyans had one party system. There was intimidation. Institutions were rendered ineffective and answered to the president, and everything that could be broken was very broken. The country was exhausted. It was desperate and hungry for new leadership, for change. So Kibaki's victory should not just be seen as a political victory. It was also a very emotional moment for the country. A country felt that at last our chains have been let loose. At last our troubles have an end in sight. a very emotional moment for Kenyans. And now we will jump into the turnaround. So we have seen what Kibaki inherited, the environment in which Kenya was at the time, and he gets into work. We have effectively a recession in 2002, given the negative GDP growth. And in 2003, the GDP rises to about 3%. 2004, it accelerates even further to 4.9%, the GDP growth rate. And then it moves to 5.8% in 2005. And in 2006, 6%. So Kenya was really pressing the accelerator here. It was regaining the potential it had lost and pointing in the right direction economically. And our GDP growth rate peaked at 6.9 to 7% in 2007. And that is the highest it had been in over 20 years. Before it fell to 1.7%. We also know that 2008 was a year of enormous challenge in Kenya. We had the post-election violence, which was a very troubling experience for Kenya that remains committed to a lot of Kenyans' memory. A tough and rough time where hundreds of thousands were displaced and thousands of people lost their lives in what was a poorly handled, poorly managed election that was not transparent and that did not inspire confidence and was exploited by politicians to the detriment of the country. But by 2009, there is some recovery where the economy gets back to 2.6% in growth rate. And in 2010, 2011, we have 5%. So we can see that there was time that it took before the Grand Coalition government stabilized and got back to the growth trajectory that we had experienced in Kibaki's first term. And by 2010, 2011, the growth rate is about 5%. I'll go through just some key statistics, some of which I have mentioned. We can see that the GDP growth rate peaked at about 6.9 to 7%, and that is the highest it had been in 20 years up to and until that point. The GDP when Kibaki is leaving office is 4.75 trillion. He peaked it at 1.04 trillion. So the growth was astounding. We also see that the debt to GDP had declined quite significantly. And in 2006, it was only 27% of the GDP at some point in 2006. We also see that the compound annual growth rate of the GDP was 14.84%. And there was significantly more development expenditure. Remember, when Mwai is leaving office, almost all the money is going to salaries, it's going to paying debt. No amount of money, or at least very small amount of money, fractional amount of money, is being spent on development. But under Kibaki, more tax revenue was collected. So revenue approximately quadrupled, increased 4 times, and expenditure on development also rose from about 54 billion under Moi at departure to about 377 billion. That is more than 7 times increase. So we had an economic recovery strategy, and there was what has now been termed the 5-year macroeconomic stabilization plan. That continues to this day, a legacy of Mwai Kibaki, and that plan worked. That is what drove the progress that we see. Okay? And so we can characterize Kibaki's leadership and what's responsible for the growth that we are seeing in various ways. One, there was a lot of fiscal discipline. There was public sector reform. There was investment in infrastructure, and the private sector grew. For those of you who have heard people talking about Mwai Kibaki and his economic legacy, many of you will hear that during his time, it was easier for people to make money. So he set a system, an environment where private businesses could grow and expand. And with that means that a lot of private actors made money, but also when they make money, they can employ more Kenyans. He is also the one who unveiled Vision 2030, which many Kenyans chide today as Vision 3020. And his goal was to get to a newly industrialized middle-income Kenya by 2030. We do not know how well we are tracking those goals, but he identified 3 pillars in Vision 2030. And next time we'll be talking about Vision 2030 in depth very soon. But those 3 pillars were economic, social, and political. And there were 10 thematic areas that Mwai Kibaki focused on. We had infrastructure, we had information and communication technology, ICT, we had agriculture, tourism, finance, manufacturing, trade, education, science and technology, and public sector reform. So this is a wide net, which, if well done, could significantly reshape the lives and the experiences of the Kenyan people. So today, we continue to organize our development around Vision 2030, even though our commitment and our progress towards it seems to not be as vibrant as it were during Kibaki's time. But that is an analysis for another day, and we'll go into the deep numbers and see how we're doing. When you're going to build something great, it's like building an enormous story building. You must have a proper foundation. And the question that many of you will ask, what is the foundation that President Mwai Kibaki laid? The foundation that Mwai Kibaki laid was a huge investment in infrastructure. Under his leadership, about 100,000 kilometers of roads were built or rehabilitated in the 9 years. There may be roads that were paved, there may be roads that were unpaved. It doesn't matter. They don't have to be tarmac. Any significant improvement in roads that makes them a little more passable means that more areas of the country are accessible, the time spent on the road is much shorter, and that could have a positive effect on the economy. It definitely has a positive effect on the economy when it's easier for movement of people and goods. And he also improved about over 7,000 kilometers of rural roads. So he was going all out. Of the many things he did, we will also recall the Nairobi-Mombasa Highway rehabilitation, which happened under his time, and that happened just months after taking office. So the Nairobi-Mombasa Highway. Many of you know about the Thika Super Highway, which is 8 lanes built during his second term, still one of the marvels of the African continent. A huge highway, super highway, we call it. And infrastructure budget increased significantly. It was about 4.9% in 2003, and it rose up to 8.7% by the end of the tenure. And when we talk about infrastructure budget, it's important to label these numbers and percentages, but it's also important to recognize that this is one of the areas where corruption is also quite significant. And I say this because there are many roads, I'm told, which on paper are tarmacked. But when you go on the ground, you realize that the contractor, or whoever was given the money, made a good life out of it, and the roads were never delivered, or the promises were never delivered. The other investment that he made as part of the foundation is ports and railroads. So the Mombasa port was dredged and expanded. 1 kilometer second container terminal was constructed, has begun, 30 billion. Okay, 1 kilometer second container terminal construction costing 30 billion Kenyan shillings. We have the Syokimau railway station was launched, and the first new railway station built in Kenya in 80 years. 80 years before a new railway was built in Kenya, a new railway station. And that was built under Kibaki, the Syokimau railway station. And then we have the Lapset corridor. Those of you who don't know the Lapset corridor, it is a Lamu port to South Sudan, Ethiopia, transport and pipeline link. So that is a pipeline link from the Lamu port all the way to South Sudan and Ethiopia, or the Lapset corridor. Okay, so that's when they drew up the Lapset blueprint. And then airports. A few of you may have used Kisumu International Airport. It was expanded during Mwai Kibaki's time, and the first phase cost approximately 3 billion Kenyan shillings. And then we added a new terminal at the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport under construction. By the end of his time in office, by the end of his tenure, he had added a new terminal at Jomo Kenyatta. It was left under construction. In terms of energy, which is also part of the foundation that he laid, he increased electricity connection across the country. It tripled over the 10 years he was in office. And they started energy centers from 10 in 2002 to 15, including Lodwar, Garissa, and Marsabit. So first time that these historically neglected northern counties were being included and connected to the national grid. So you can see that he made progress across the board. Okay. The next thing we will talk about is telecoms and the digital, the revolution that Kibaki enabled. So when Kibaki is getting into office, there are less than 3 million mobile subscribers. 3 million. By the time he's leaving, there are about 30 million. When Kibaki is getting into office, the people who were using the internet were only 250,000 Kenyans who are on the internet. By the time he is leaving office, 14 million people in 2012 were on the internet. So all this progress does not happen on itself or on its own. He enabled, and it happened under his leadership. So we can see that, as I mentioned, 3 million mobile subscribers. When Kibaki is getting in, 30 million, 10 times increase. By the end of his leadership, it got to 32.2 million, which was a significant growth. The same for the internet. A lot of us in Kenya use the internet now, but he laid the foundation. The increase was rapid. 250,000 people using the internet in 2003. And then now the internet is across the country, 14 million people using it in 2012. The number must be significantly larger now. Please let me know in the comments if you have the correct figure. And then something huge that has changed Kenya a great deal was born in Kenya under Kibaki's leadership and watch, and was launched in 2007, M-Pesa. Many of us don't fully appreciate how impactful M-Pesa has been on the Kenyan economy. There was technically very limited ways to send money to your relatives, to buy money, to buy objects, or to buy any products online. So M-Pesa transactions have made a huge impact and have revolutionized finance in Africa and in the world. M-Pesa has been studied by so many people, born in Kenya under the leadership of Kibaki. While it might not have been Kibaki's idea, but ideas spring up under certain leadership because the environment enables the growth of such ideas. And it's hard to think of any similar ideas growing and developing under the leadership of, say, someone like President Moi or others. So it's important to give credit to his leadership because M-Pesa developed then and expanded to what it is today. With so many, there are more M-Pesa accounts in Kenya than the number of Kenyans. So the usage is huge. The penetration is enormous. Almost everyone has access to it now, as long as you have a phone. And then we can also speak to broadcasting and media. In Kenya, we enjoy a lot of media freedom. There's a great deal of that. And this was deliberately stifled under Moi. It was unthinkable. But by the time Kibaki was leaving office, there were 81 radio stations and 19 television stations. In other words, there was plural competitive media landscape. Under Moi, this was unimaginable because Moi would have preferred an environment where there are few media actors, where it's easier to step on them if you need to. And then we had the Konza. Many of you heard about Konza City. I don't know how far it is now and how well it's doing. I don't hear a lot of Konza City, but he launched it as the Vision 2030 flagship. It was supposed to be the Africa's Silicon Savannah, 5,000-acre technology hub, the Konza Technopolis. And it was 60 kilometers from Nairobi. All this is coming during Kibaki's time, okay? The last segment, as far as the foundation goes, is to talk about human capital. And in this segment, we will look at education and healthcare. This is the people side of the economic transformation, and it's just as important. And it is also one area where Kibaki performed exemplarily well. He introduced what I always refrain from calling free primary education. And I refrain from calling it free primary education because at the end of the day, someone pays for it. There is hardly anything that's free in the world. And in the case of education, this is taxpayer-funded education is how I'll describe it. But in any case, call it what you may, the idea is that more people had access to education and that the fees in public primary schools was abolished. This was in less than 2 weeks after taking office. You can tell that this was a gentleman on a mission. And so it was not a gradual rollout or we'll start this county or this year. No, he gets into office, abolishment of the fees that was being paid for people to access education. And a lot of us where we are today, thanks to that change. And many people talk about Gen Z being so educated. Kibaki may take a lot of credit for that. And the education budget was increased. It was only 12.4% of the national budget in 2004. It rose to 17.4% in 2005. When Kibaki is getting into office, we have 6.6 million pupils, as they used to call us in primary school. That number rises to 10.1 million, 20% increase from 2003 to 2002 to 2003. The enrollment rose by 1.1 million, just 1 year. Okay. So by measure of primary enrollment, it increased significantly. It more than doubled because there are adults who never had access, adults who had never had access to education. They went to school for the first time. And so this program did not only help young kids, it also helped adults who now saw, okay, education is free now, let us go and be part of this system. There was actually a gentleman called Kimani Maruge, who enrolled in grade 1 on January 12, 2004, at the age of 84. He became the oldest person to ever begin primary school, and he holds a Guinness World Record. That story speaks to the access of education that Kibaki created. This is what UNESCO stated back then. So we have a story, and we can see the impact of Mwai Kibaki. Education was free. Everyone is excited to go to school, and an 84-year-old enrolls in class 1 thanks to his programs. In terms of higher education, when Kibaki took office, there were 6 public universities, only 6. By the time he's leaving in 2013, we have 22 public universities. So we can see that Kibaki is making changes in every space, but particularly education. And I think this is one of his strongest areas. This is where he has the biggest record. And because the impact of this continues to reverberate long after he's gone. Many of us were educated in primary school under Kibaki, and we are a product of a system that was encouraging and creating space for many more people to be educated. And then in terms of university enrollment, we had 71,000 people, students enrolled in universities in 2003, 71,832. In 2013, that number nearly tripled to 195,428. Okay. The next thing is the healthcare. And in healthcare, we'll talk about ARVs, antiretroviral treatment, which is important for HIV/AIDS patients. So the treatment was inaccessible when Kibaki was getting into office. But then he rolled out the low-cost drugs after he got into power at around 2003. So a lot of HIV-positive individuals benefited from this program. And we are told that by 2005, about 65,000 Kenyans who are HIV positive were on the antiretroviral drugs, which are known to be very helpful and effective in dealing with HIV. Okay. By 2007, 29% of eligible Kenyans were receiving the ARVs, the antiretroviral drugs, and then that rate went to about 61% in 2012. So we can see that the policy was having an effect on the Kenyan lives. And today, by 2017, that number was about 1.136 million Kenyans on antiretroviral therapy. So quite significant. And then the distribution of mosquito nets. I remember very well when we were young, mosquito nets will come, we will go to hospital to pick mosquito nets. These things do not happen in a vacuum. We had free malaria drugs provided, or free drugs provided, whether it's for malaria, for tuberculosis, for HIV and AIDS, straight from day one. And when you think of mosquito nets, and we may not be able to fully quantify the effect that it had on people and on especially malaria-infested areas, but these are steps that help improve the health of people and that make a huge difference. And Kibaki did work in that regard. Now we'll take a little bit of a pivot because you're going to talk about the strategic pivot and the new trading partners that Kibaki brought to Kenya. So Kibaki changed who Kenya talked to. It was a geopolitical move that had an impact on the way we live economically as a country. And so he made a very deliberate choice to ensure that his reliance on Western donor aid was minimized. Today, Kenya gets a small fraction of its revenue from donor money. A lot of people think that African countries are funded by donor money. It is a very tiny amount, which if taken out, could technically be inconsequential. And so the impact of this was that by 2005, the IMF was no longer controlling Kenya's economic policy because Kibaki had technically gotten off of that reliance on Western donor aid and debt. And so he was very careful. And then he moved more east, created partnerships, got into major trading deals with China. And that is where we got the affordable motorcycles. For those of you who don't know, motorcycles, boda, were introduced during Kibaki's time when he went to China, created trade deals, and got very affordable motorcycles. And now, the boda industry is one of the biggest employers in the country. And hundreds of thousands of jobs have been created for young Kenyans. Those young Kenyans, if they did not have bodas and motorbikes, what will they be doing now? It's a question we should ponder on, and a question that should help us realize the importance of proper leadership when we are electing our leaders. He also supported East African Community Common Market. He really pushed for free movement of goods, services, and people across this region. We also talked about the Lapset Corridor, ensuring the interconnectivity of the region and opening it up for economic expansion, for increased economic activity, and greater intertwinement of our economies with our neighbors in Eastern and East Africa. So up to until this point, we have painted a very rosy picture of the man that is Mwai Kibaki. Indeed, we can see his legacy has taken a very profound shape and has changed the way we think about economics in our country. And a lot of his initiatives continue to influence Kenya's economic policy to this day. But there are a few things that Mwai Kibaki got wrong. The first thing is what I alluded to earlier on, which is the broken promise. Mwai Kibaki came on an anti-corruption campaign. And he understood that where there's corruption, growth becomes very difficult. However, there were several scandals under his leadership. We have the Anglo leasing, billions of shillings paid to a shadowy company for services that never materialized. And that scandal involved people who are very close to the president. And the man he had appointed, John Githongo, as the PS for Governance and Ethics, resigned in 2005. And his concern was that he lacked support from the president in dealing with these corruption issues. So that was a huge scandal that happened during Kibaki's time, and not much was done, and his own PS resigned as a result because he felt he did not receive sufficient support from the president. And in Kenya, fighting corruption, when the president is not on your side, as we can all see, can be quite difficult. That said, Kibaki was never personally accused of corruption. It happened under his leadership. And as with leadership, when anything happens under your leadership and you cannot explain, then you take responsibility. We can also see that he had a difficulty in just making sure that that culture of corruption is contained. So he lacked the muscle to deal with corruption. And there were 2 corruption commission reports that were also not implemented under his leadership. The other thing, and this almost always happens when there is a rapid economic growth, wealth becomes concentrated. And so by 2013, approximately 49.5% of Kenyans, almost 21.5 million Kenyans, were still living below the poverty line. So even though Kibaki did a lot, there were many Kenyans who were left behind. So the inequality gap widened. And so even though there were all these GDP records and everyone is making money and everything is, but half the country is still poor. So it begs the question, who was Kibaki really helping if half the country is poor? So the growth was real. The country was making more. The country was becoming bigger economically, but that bigger pie was increasingly getting concentrated in fewer hands. And so a lot of the rural areas, the arid north and the informal settlements did not immediately feel the growth that Kenya was experiencing by and large. We can also speak to education. And the challenge here was the implementation gap. You can come in with a lot of goals, aspirations, and good intentions. So we had free primary education, which was great policy, but the execution was not done well. There were no new classrooms built to absorb 1 million pupils who joined just a year after he said, voila, free primary education, and everyone is going to school, and there are no classrooms built to accommodate those classrooms. In other words, 1 million pupils had just to fit in somehow. You can imagine what that scenario looks like, and it looks that way to this day. A lot of classes are extremely packed. The teacher-to-student ratio jumped from 1 to 40 to 1 to 60. These are young children who are growing up. How could the teachers possibly dedicate sufficient time to each one of them? And you're dealing with a crowd of 60, 70, or even 80. So the student-teacher ratio remained quite huge. So Kibaki introduced a good policy, but the implementation was not the greatest. On one hand, I feel that sometimes you have to start somewhere. You don't have to wait until the conditions are perfect. And I think if I were Kibaki, I'll probably have done the same as opposed to waiting until we have all the classrooms built and then moving in and saying that we have this free policy. There is something that continues to hurt Kenyans to this day. And I say this because it is something that directly affected my family, and many Kenyans suffered this wound that they did not have to suffer under Kibaki's Kibaki's leadership. There was the 2007 election, which was disputed. The results were announced amid chaos, and there was a lot of international concern. And so this is one time when we see Kibaki, the statesman, putting himself before his country. He was sworn in within an hour of being declared the winner. Many will ask, why the rush? And then the aftermath is a fallout. Over 1,200 Kenyans lost their lives. They were killed as a result of the post-election violence. That is a lot of bloodshed that could be avoided. Were it not for the recklessness of leaders, the lack of transparency, and just the absence of proper leadership to bring the country together in such a moment of crisis. And close to about 600,000 people, more than 500,000 people, were displaced. There were very sad cases of people who were walking several hundreds of kilometers just to avoid conflict. I'm sure they really struggled with getting food. It was very dangerous to go outside. And that has really affected the way Kenyans think about elections. And Kenyans are overall very scared of elections because they understand how far they can go. So it was a very sad moment in Kenyan history, one which Kibaki and his legacy will remain associated with and continues to taint his name to this day. And the aftermath was our GDP growth rate also fell significantly from 7% in 2007 at the peak and dipped all the way to 1.7% in 2008. So all these actions have impact that people can feel directly. And that was a huge political failure, a huge economic failure. And we can also see that the post-election violence inquiry commission see that all this was also a consequence of Kibaki's failure to maintain political legitimacy. Okay? We also see a change. When Kibaki got in the first term, there was incredible, remarkable fiscal discipline. He wasn't just spending and borrowing all the way he could. But in his second term, he started ramping up borrowing. Domestic borrowing more than tripled, and foreign borrowing also increased. And so we can see a start towards more borrowing, which is different from his first term, where there was a lot more fiscal and financial discipline. And his budget also exploded. Even though the GDP grew, the budget did not grow. Even though the GDP grew, the budget grew much faster. And we can see that the debt trajectory that Uhuru Kenyatta later inherits is such that the government is now set on a borrowing path. And what I've seen with a lot of countries, once you start borrowing, you always need to borrow more to settle the interest on one hand and to also meet other financial obligations that the government meets. And we can see a quote from John Githongo, who was a former PS, as I mentioned, Permanent Secretary for Governance and Ethics, in The Elephant, which he wrote in May 2022. For those of you who haven't seen it, The Elephant is a platform where a lot of Kenyans, especially Kenyans, real Kenyans who have been involved, political commentators and such, write a lot of their thoughts. And we can see a quote that says, "I don't hate Mwai Kibaki. I never have. He isn't a man who caused me to hate. He is someone who broke my heart," which speaks to the frustration that he felt at that time. Let us conclude this on a positive note. And then we have the 2010 Constitution. For me, this is a huge economic reform that many do not call an economic reform. We have a new architecture of how our economy works. And even though 2010 looks like politics and everything, I think it is very much economics, because we move into devolution, where the money is now going to counties and local governments. Development decision-making is coming closer to the people. Initially, we have the national government, which will decide we are going to build a hospital in place A. The national government, huge as it may be, cannot effectively determine the priorities of Kakamega County, Kisumu County, Mombasa County, Wajir, Turkana, Bomet, Isiolo, Nandi, Kiambu, Kisii, all these counties. The government cannot effectively determine the priorities of these counties and implement all of them. But with devolution, Kakamega knows the most important things it needs to address. Bungoma knows what it needs to address. Siaya knows what it needs to address. And so does Lamu, so does Kilifi, so does all other areas of Kenya. We also see that the 2010 Constitution introduces much more stronger institutions, and key among them, the independent judiciary, which is very important. But we also get the National Land Commission, which addresses one of Kenya's most destabilizing and troubling issues, the land injustices that have happened since the colonial period, where many people have been deprived of land. They are squatters, they are struggling to get by, which by its very nature is not the way Africa has always been. In Africa, you got land, you got an ancestral space, there was enough space for everyone. But once this land was accumulated in few hands and many more people deprived of it and many more squatters as a result or consequence of some of the initial challenges and decisions that were made by the first government of Kenya, we have had a very serious problem. And the areas that have been troubled by this more than others, especially in the coastal region. So we have the National Land Commission to address these injustices. A lot of questions can be raised as to how effective it has been. The issue remains a political one, and people continue to bargain on it, to vie for leadership on it, on this specific topic, which tells you it's a thorny issue that has not gone away yet, but that was a step in the right direction introduced by our 2010 Constitution. And as we know that the most fundamental economic asset is land. If you don't have land, let's just assume the most unlikely scenario, and maybe it's not unlikely, but assuming one person bought the entire of Kenya's land, every other person effectively becomes a squatter and has to rent on the terms of the owner of that land. So land distribution is an important topic from our African context. And I say African context because there are regions in the world where people rent and the majority of the people rent and that's their lifestyle. Perhaps Kenya is headed in that direction, but for the most part, land was something that every member of society had a share of, and the kind of distribution that we now have was not the case back then. And so Kibaki said that the constitution I promulgated in August 2010 is the boldest step the Kenyan people have taken towards changing their lives. So this was huge. And his son Jimmy Kibaki said that his greatest moment was the promulgation of the new constitution. It was very deep and an emotional moment for Mwai Kibaki. And so after his failed referendum in 2005, after the 2007-2008 crisis, Kibaki and Raila worked together for the 2010 constitution. These were two bitter rivals, went against each other, but this moment brought them together. It was one national moment. The constitution passed in a referendum and Kenya changed. And so to bring it all together, Kibaki brought macroeconomic stabilization in our country. The economy was very stable from near 0% growth to approximately 7%. Good progress. Fiscal discipline, the public debt was high. He brought it really low. In 2006, it was significantly low. Investment in infrastructure from roads, ports, airports, and the railroads. Investment in human capital, 1 million more children going into school in year one, including our 84-year-old Guinness World Record holder. And then we have the digital foundations. Think about economics, mobile, M-Pesa, mobile subscribers rising to 30 million from a much smaller number. We have strategic planning, thinking about Vision 2030. Perhaps that's the only major vision that we have seen significantly being followed by Kenya. And we are yet to see what else will follow. We can also think about the constitutional reform. What he got wrong, anti-corruption follow-through. One of his biggest failures, he promised much, delivered very little. He started very actively to fight corruption, perhaps realized soon that he couldn't do it or whatever it was, or perhaps it really touched on people who were close to him. Whatever it was, he proved ineffective at fighting corruption. Political inclusion, there was growth. People made money, but that money increasingly became concentrated. So a lot of Kenyans did not feel ownership of that growth. 2007, this cost the country enormously. 1,200 Kenyans like you and I. And our GDP also declines significantly. But what is GDP when so many people's lives are affected in ways that they shouldn't? Because 1,200 lives are 1,200 families affected, and that number gets really huge when you think about each of these person knowing and being known by quite a number of other people who are directly affected by their demise. And the question of education quality. Yes, we had free education, but as one political commentator says it in Kenya, that education is free, but free of knowledge. So we are accessing education, but of what quality? And you could say there are few schools that do well in Kenya, but what happens to the thousands of rural schools where there is little access to learning resources, the teacher to student ratio, the number of teachers being hired, the quality of the classroom environment and the school environment, the quality of the training institutes for teachers. And so there's a lot to be said about education being accessible, but what are you accessing? And there are many who have benefited from education, but there are also many who live under the thought that they have access to education when in real sense they don't get much at the end of their educational experience. There are also many things he started but left for others to finish. He started Vision 2030, which remains the framework. He started devolution, which we are still trying to figure out how it should work. Nation building is a long process, and we are in that process. He started the digital economy, and Uhuru came in and has taken it further, and Ruto is now there, so he laid the foundation. He set up the regional integration, and we continue to see progress, whether it's on the LAPSET corridor, on the East African community. He also left behind a corruption culture, which he did not clean, and that remains one of Kenya's most stubborn diseases. And to this day, we have not seen a person who is committed to ending corruption in our country. And so the lasting lesson for our African continent and for the good of country is that the economic competence alone is not sufficient. Political legitimacy is not optional. The cost of Kibaki failing to establish political legitimacy in post-2007 election was so huge. Therefore, every leader in Africa needs to seek political legitimacy. And then inclusion is not something we do for the sake of. It's not something that it's not a luxury that we can immediately part with. Inclusion is key, it's important, and any growth story must consistently think about bringing as many people on board as possible. And any growth that happens in the country that is felt by a fraction of the country and a larger population doesn't feel it is always a ticking time bomb. And so we need to ensure that when we are developing in Africa, we are not leaving people behind, because we know what that does and what that can do. And the other thing that we can also learn is that we should be willing to be heartbroken by the gap between what's possible and what was achieved. That heartbreak will always fuel us to demand even better. Kibaki set us on a right path. What was possible almost felt endless. What was achieved was great, but we know that there's a lot more that could be achieved. Mwai Kibaki gave Kenya its best decade of economic growth. He also gave Kenya its worst post-independence political violence. Both are true, and both of these truths must be held. That is how I'll summarize Kibaki's political journey. Thank you very much for being with me. This data that I used here comes from various sources: the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, Central Bank of Kenya, World Bank, Africa Check, UNESCO, IMF, NASCOP, Ministry of Education, Communications Authority of Kenya, Business Daily, the East African, and the research that we have done is LeadAfrik.com. I will conclude by saying what Kibaki said: LeadAfrik, not LeadAfrik. LeadAfrik is a platform that we are developing, and we hope that you can check it out, LeadAfrik.com. But in the words of Kibaki, leadership is a privilege to better the lives of others. It's not an opportunity to satisfy personal greed. Thank you very much.